All right, Waxahachie Global students, here we are for Chapter 10, Photosynthesis. I would love to tell you that photosynthesis is just the complete opposite of respiration, and that you could just look at Chapter 9 in reverse, but of course that's not exactly true. Everything in biology seems to be pretty messy and complicated, unfortunately for biology students. So while photosynthesis is, in many cases, sort of the reverse procedure of respiration, there is a few more details that we have to take a look at. So Chapter 10 is all about photosynthesis, probably the most important chemical reaction on planet Earth. So just to get us started, our overview says that this is the process that feeds the biosphere. This is the most important chemical chemical process of all life on Earth. Photosynthesis is the process that converts solar energy into chemical energy, and then that chemical energy can then be used by living creatures, whether they eat plants or eat animals who eat plants, to fuel their own living processes. So directly or indirectly, photosynthesis pretty much is the nourishment, the energy source for all of the living world. And in a way, you could say that you and every living creature on Earth is solar powered. Whoops, look. Check out the spelling error there. Let me fix that really quick. There we go, solar powered. So let's say you have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch today. Well, that peanut butter came from the peanut plants, of course, and the jelly came from whatever fruit it's made out of. And those plants originally got that energy that is stored now within the bread, within the peanut butter. Those plants that were used to form that material that you're eating, your sandwich, they got their energy through photosynthesis, and then they stored that solar energy in the various organic molecules, the glucose and the starches and all the various things that make up that sandwich. So you are then taking that energy, and through the process of digestion and cellular respiration, which we've already looked at, you are releasing some of that stored energy. And within you, that energy is then put to use for your own living processes. So the body heat that you produce, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius, that body heat as a byproduct of some of these chemical reactions is basically the energy that was captured from the sun. So in a way, it's almost like you are reconstituting the thermal energy that originally came via the sun's rays down to Earth after about 8.5 minutes of travel through millions of miles of space. So all life on Earth is solar powered, just in a very indirect fashion. So we're going to look at the photosynthesis process that captures that sunlight and turns it into useful products. Plants and other creatures that are able to do photosynthesis are called autotrophs. Auto meaning they're able to feed themselves. So autotroph means they're able to sustain themselves without eating other creatures or getting their nutrition from another source. Autotrophs are also called producers because they are the ones that produce the organic molecules that allow all other creatures to live. Almost all plants are what we call photoautotrophs. They use the energy of sunlight to make organic molecules. There are other living creatures other than what we would call just directly plants that are also photosynthetic, but in this chapter we'll primarily be focusing on the plants. So a beautiful picture here, a slight double rainbow. You can see the second one right there. How does the light from the sun become food? How does light from the sun become a peanut butter and jelly sandwich sitting on your plate? And why would we say that all living creatures are solar powered? Well, we're going to take a look at that process. Kind of a complicated process, but a very interesting process. So I already mentioned that photosynthesis occurs in a number of living creatures. Mainly, of course, we think about plants, but there are certain types of algae and other protists and even some of the prokaryotic creatures that also are able to do photosynthesis. And these creatures feed themselves as well as the rest of the world. A good place to start would be the Bioflix animation. So I would definitely take the time to go and look up the Chapter 10 notes and find the Bioflix animation and take a look at it. I think it's a good way to start to kind of get you an overview, kind of physically see sort of what's happening, and then we'll go from there. Lots of different creatures, we said, do photosynthesis. Of course, plants is what we normally think of, trees and grass and things of that nature. Multicellular algae. On land, it's mainly plants that would do this photosynthetic activity, but in the water, say the oceans, lakes, and streams, there's actually quite a few different creatures. Multicellular algae and some of the unicellular protists, and then all the way down to the more simple creatures like the bacteria, some of the different types of bacteria and the cyanobacteria. They also do photosynthesis. So photosynthesis can be found in some pretty ancient varieties of life all the way up into the land plants that we're more familiar with. On the flip side, where animals and humans and goldfish and kittens are, would be heterotrophs. And heterotrophs cannot feed themselves, so they have to get their food from a different source. They obtain their food from organic material that is obtained from other creatures. So they are either eating the plants directly or they're eating animals who eat plants somewhere along the line in that food chain there. Heterotrophs are called the consumers of the biosphere, and they would include humans and kittens and dogs and whales and all the other creatures that cannot do photosynthesis. On kind of a side note, whether it's plants, which are basically the formations of coal, which would be the primarily aquatic plant life that is decayed and then become coal, or whether it's natural gas or oil, which is primarily deposits that have changed over time from microscopic ancient living animals and creatures. The Earth's supply of fossil fuels is actually the remains of these living creatures that lived millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. So in a sense, the fossil fuels that we burn today, whether it's coal or oil or natural gas, we're actually kind of re-releasing the solar energy that was captured millions of years ago. So when you're burning a tank of gas in your car, propelling your car forward, the burning of that gasoline is actually the release of solar energy that was captured at a time when dinosaurs roamed the earth. So it's kind of weird to think how that energy can be captured and then stored within the earth for millions of years, and then we're releasing it now. Of course, we do have limited supplies of these materials. We're using them far faster than the earth can create them. So one of the things that scientists are looking at is alternative fuels by using plants and algae and the photosynthetic process to create different, what we call biofuels. And there's a couple of different ways that this can be done. Some of them involve the production of ethanol, which we're going to find out in one type of system here. Plants create ethanol, which can then be burned as a fuel. So there's a couple of different ways that we can do this, and this would be kind of a greener, more environmentally friendly, perhaps a more sustainable energy source than fossil fuels. One route would be, let's see, fermentation. We talked about fermentation when we were discussing respiration in the last chapter. So fermentation is one method that can be used here, and then of course there are others as well. So let's get started with Chapter 10, Concept 10.1. It says photosynthesis converts light energy to chemical energy of food, and that's kind of your overall big idea. The way that plants do this is because they have a special type of structure, a special type of plastid, it's called. It's kind of like a particular organelle within their cells called chloroplasts. And we're going to find that chloroplasts are very structurally similar to some of the photosynthetic bacteria that we see from ancient times. So just like where we talked about the mitochondria might have been the result of this endosymbiosis, where the early eukaryotic cell basically engulfed this other bacteria, and then that became a mitochondria. Well, a lot of scientists think the same thing happened with the chloroplasts, that originally chloroplasts were their own photosynthetic separate bacteria, and that they were engulfed by an early eukaryotic cell, and then they developed into an organelle that we now call the chloroplast. So the structure of this particular type of organelle is what allows it to do this job of photosynthesis. But if we look at its structure, it's very similar to some basic photosynthetic bacteria as well. Where would we find these chloroplasts within the plants? Primarily anywhere where you see green. So if you see green, whether that's in the leaves or the stem, you're going to find chloroplasts. So obviously the leaves are the major locations for photosynthesis, and that green comes from the chemical chlorophyll, which is the particular pigment we're going to be kind of focusing on in the chloroplast. Chloroplasts are found mainly in the cells of what's called the mesophyll or the mesophyll, which is the interior portion of the leaf, and each of these mesophyll or mesophyll cells can contain 30 to 40 chloroplasts. So they are packed in there, and there's quite a few of them, which is really what gives the plant that coloration, the green color that we see and we're so familiar with. The basics of how this works is that CO2, carbon dioxide, enters, and oxygen, we're going to find out, exits through the leaf in these tiny little openings or pores called stomata. And the stomata can actually be opened and closed depending on environmental conditions. And then the chlorophyll itself is not just floating freely within the chloroplast, it's kind of bound in these special little membranes or sacs called thylakoids. And so these are all little interconnected sacs within the chloroplast. Oftentimes these thylakoids are kind of in stacked columns, and these stacked columns we call grana. And then within the chloroplast there's also a thick liquid outside of these thylakoids that's called stroma. That's kind of the interior fluid of the chloroplast. If you see a picture of it, you might think of it kind of as the grana, the stacks of thylakoids, as stacks of pancakes. And the thylakoids are each the individual pancakes. The stack is called the grana, and then the thick liquid that surrounds them, the stroma, is kind of like the pancake syrup, perhaps. So let's take a look at a picture, because it's always better than just talking about it and doing words. So at the top here we have the leaf. Kind of looks like an elm tree here. And if we were to zoom into the leaf, into the interior of the leaf, into the mesophyll or the mesophyll, the spongy cellular layer in the middle, we're going to have chloroplasts. Lots and lots of chloroplasts within those cells inside there. On the outside surface, usually on most plants, not all, but on the vast majority of plants, on the underside of the leaf is where the stomata are. The stomata are the tiny little pores or openings that allow gases and water to enter and exit. They also show a little leaf vein here, so if you see the veins in the leaf, it's kind of like a separate structure made up of different types of cells that carries material through to the leaf. We zoom in even further on a little chlorophyll here, or actually one cell of the mesophyll. We have what looks like this. This is an actual photograph taken through a microscope. Zooming in even further, we go to this little drawing of the chloroplast. Inside you can see the thylakoid membrane stacks, which are called the grana, and then surrounding the grana inside here is a kind of a thick liquid called the stroma. Here we're zoomed in even closer. You can see that the chloroplast, very similar to the mitochondria, has two membranes, the inner and outer membrane, which again kind of indicates that perhaps at one time it was its own living separate bacteria. Inside again are these stacks called grana or granum, plural. And then these are made up of the thylakoid. This is the thylakoid membrane, and then the liquid inside is called the stroma. Here's an actual microscope photo taken. Probably looks like a slice through, and you can kind of see some of these structures in the picture below. So what about the chemistry of photosynthesis? If we wanted to kind of track the chemistry and the particular molecules or atoms involved, this is what it would look like. This is the basic chemical formula, I guess you could say, for photosynthesis. It's a pretty complex reaction, but we can summarize it or break it down into this basic chemical reaction that you see. We have 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 12 water molecules, and then we're going to use the light energy from the sun to get this done. That's going to yield 1 molecule of glucose. C6H12O6 is glucose. 6 molecules of oxygen, the binary molecule oxygen there, and then 6 molecules of H2O, which is water. So we're going to use glucose continually, just like we did in respiration. Glucose is kind of going to be our model organic molecule. But we're actually going to find out that the direct actual product that's created by photosynthesis is a 3-carbon sugar that's abbreviated G3P. And that G3P can then be used to make glucose or actually other materials as well. So we're going to call it glucose, or we're going to say glucose, but you're going to find out that G3P is the actual product that's made via photosynthesis. One very cool thing that's going on inside these chloroplasts as part of the photosynthetic process is the splitting of water into its constituent components. So we have water, which is H2O, of course, and through photosynthesis there are enzymes within the chloroplast that actually split water apart into its separate hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen is eventually going to be incorporated into the G3P or the glucose that we're going to make, the organic molecules, the sugar molecules, and the oxygen is actually going to be released out of the stomata and into the air that we breathe. Thank goodness for that. If you wanted to track exactly where the particular reactants and products go in this process, so you can see that the carbon from the carbon dioxide becomes part of the glucose molecule, and the hydrogen also becomes part of the glucose molecule, and then some of these hydrogens will become parts of the water, and then the oxygen itself will either become parts of all three, so either the glucose or the water or just the freely released oxygen. We kind of talked about how photosynthesis is, if we simplified the idea, it's the reverse of respiration. So if we think about it as the reversing the direction of the electron flow compared to respiration. So photosynthesis is a redox process. It involves oxidation and reduction reactions in which we're taking water, we're going to oxidize water, and we're going to reduce carbon dioxide. So with the water, we're going to oxidize the water, which means we're going to strip electrons from it, and we're going to reduce the carbon dioxide, which means we're going to add electrons to it. Photosynthesis is the opposite of respiration in that photosynthesis is an endergonic process. In other words, it requires an energy input because remember, we are building something here. This is an anabolic process, so it requires an input of energy, and that energy is going to come primarily from sunlight. That energy boost is provided by the light of the sun. So again, just another chemical formula. Using the energy from sunlight, we're going to reduce carbon dioxide. In other words, we're going to add electrons to it. And we're going to oxidize water. We're going to take electrons from that. So you can kind of see how H's, which would be the electrons plus the protons, are added to the carbon and are taken from the oxygen. Just to get a quick preview before we kind of get down to the nitty-gritty, dirty details, photosynthesis occurs kind of in two stages, and we call these two stages usually called the light reactions and then sometimes the dark reactions, which is not perhaps the best name for it. The light reactions, that's the photo part. That involves the sunlight, requires sunlight to occur. And then the second part that some people call the dark reactions, which is a poor name, it involves what's called the Calvin cycle. And we might want to call that the light-independent reactions because it doesn't require light for these reactions to occur, but we wouldn't say that they occur in the dark. As a matter of fact, we're going to find out they primarily occur during the day because of the way they're tied to the light reactions. So let's think of it this way. The first part is the photo part, the light reactions, and the second part, which is light independent, is called the Calvin cycle, and that is the synthesis part. That's where we are creating these, eventually the sugar molecules. So the light reactions in the thylakoids are going to split water apart and release oxygen, and they're going to take one of the electron carriers called NADP+, and they're going to add electrons to it, and that's going to reduce it to NADPH. And they're also going to generate some ATPs from ADP by that process called photophosphorylation, where we're going to add a phosphate group to ATP, and we're going to add a phosphate group to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and that's going to create ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So here's where the solar energy is captured and transformed into stored potential chemical energy. So we split water, we release that oxygen, we take those hydrogen electrons with the protons, we reduce NADP+ to NADPH, and then we generate some ATP as well. So now we have some ATP and we have some NADPH, which is kind of carrying those energized electrons, and then they can be carried over for another purpose. So on to the second part of the cycle, the Calvin cycle. This is going to happen in the stroma, that thick liquid outside of the thylakoid stacks. And this is where we take and we form sugar. We use carbon dioxide. We use the carbon from the carbon dioxide. And we're going to use the energy that was in the ATP and the NADPH that we already created. This cycle begins with something called carbon fixation, which is where we take the inorganic carbon from CO2 and we incorporate it into what we call an organic carbon molecule, which would involve some oxygen and hydrogen as well. So like the G3P or eventually what might become the glucose. Notice that we call the CO2 like inorganic carbon. So even though it does contain carbon, we kind of think of it as inorganic because it's not produced by a living creature and it's not containing some of the other major components such as hydrogen. Really, when we think about something that's organic, it's usually involving carbon, of course, but also hydrogen. So in this second step, we're going to take that chemical energy that we created in the first step using the sunlight, and we're going to use that chemical energy to make organic food molecules out of carbon dioxide, basically. So let's take a look at these basic steps. So here we have a chloroplast, and within the chloroplast, you have light energy that shines onto the leaf. That light energy is going to be used for what's called the light reactions that occur inside the thylakoid here. We're going to need water for this. We're actually going to split that water apart, and we're going to be releasing oxygen and using the hydrogens, we're going to need to use some chemicals here, NAD plus and ADP, to go into this entire reaction that's going to occur. From that reaction, we're going to release that oxygen into the air. Thank goodness for people and dogs and other creatures that need it. We're also going to produce some ATP, and we're going to produce some NADPH. So these were our ingredients going in: light, water, NADP plus and ADP, plus another phosphate group. And from those reactions, we gave off the byproduct of oxygen, created some ATP and NADPH. Those ATP and NADPH are used in what's called the Calvin cycle, and the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma, so in that thick liquid within the chloroplast, not within the thylakoid membrane stacks. And in that Calvin cycle, we're going to take in carbon dioxide. We're also going to be, because this is a cycle, we're going to be recreating the ADP and NADP plus that can be reused in some of these light reactions over here. And then finally, that's going to give us an end product of sugar. In this case, CH2O, but this G3P molecule that we're going to create can be made into a wide variety of sugars and other materials. So if you needed a good overview, these 3 or 4 slides in a row do a great job of just a basic overview. So we have the first part, which is the light reactions. We have the second part, which is the Calvin cycle. And that ends with our sugar molecule, which is kind of our end product that we're trying to create. We're going to pause right there. That's 10.1, concept 10.1. We're going to move on and look at the messy details in just a moment, and go grab you some food, step outside, and say hello and thank you to the plants and trees that are out there for producing oxygen and making food necessary for all life on Earth. We'll come right back.